And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this part 26 of Mussolini, an Italian American perspective. Okay, guys. Tonight I'd like to take on the topic of Mussolini and Hilaire Belloc. That's right. Catholic historian Hilaire Belloc, who was a great admirer of Mussolini. And it's interesting, this topic, because it's very difficult to find information on it, very limited on it. And the more I try to do research, and maybe I just missed something on my online searches, the very few things I could find on it. And honestly, as I do this cast tonight, I'm gonna pull from two resources that I think are very familiar to some of you, especially Catholics. In fact, let me bring them up here. The first of which is Tradition in Action, which is a site that's been up for a few years. It's a Catholic site. There's an article written here by Patrick O'Doux that decided to take on this topic of Hilaire Belloc being an admirer of Mussolini. And that is because Hilaire Belloc wrote a book. I don't know what year it was published. I got a copy of it a while back. Had to be probably in the 30s, right around there, when Mussolini was in a state of power in Italy. The Cruise of the Nona, and he wrote about the admiration he had for Mussolini. And so Patrick O'Doux here from Tradition in Action, he takes more of a negative position on this idea, or at least this admiration that Belloc had for Mussolini, right? I think it's very scary for a lot of Catholics who don't understand the history of Italy and fascism, and at that time what the Catholic world was going through, and how to view this, especially if you've been Americanized and liberalized in many ways. It's a problem unless you really take a deep understanding of who Mussolini is, and what real fascism was, or at least what it attempted to do, despite all of its flaws that it may have had to a certain capacity, its strengths and its flaws, really, for that matter. And so Tradition in Action is one source we'll use. It's the written source that I'll use on this, and it's, like I said, it's the negative side of this relationship and what Belloc had to say about Mussolini. The other one here, I'm going back to an old what do you want to call it? Friend of ours, Trad Patrick of Rights and Duties. Do you guys remember Trad Patrick? He's the guy that got me interested in really looking into Mussolini many years ago. Funny story how I ran into Trad Patrick, at least his show. And now Trad Patrick is gone. He got into some controversy online, and unfortunately he's gone. I got to talk to him, I think, once or twice. I interviewed him once. He had a big influence within the sphere of Catholic traditionalism. He knew a lot of people within that realm. But I got to know Trad Patrick, and how I found him about 5 years ago. I was doing some research online. I was actually looking for counterpoints against Timothy Gordon's thesis in his book, Catholic Republic. The idea that America somehow is a crypto-Catholic nation. And honestly, there's not a whole lot of critiques of that out there. But the one guy that was more than willing to critique it was Trad Patrick, as well as challenged Mr. Gordon on many of his theses when he was around. Now, for Trad Patrick, he was a really hoorah, pro-Mussolini guy. And in many ways, when I discovered Trad Patrick, he made it palpable to actually try to understand Mussolini. It's something I always appreciate about Trent Patrick, because I never heard this point of view before. You just don't get a defense of, he called himself a fascist, right? I call myself an integralist. But for his part, he was kind of a hoorah, pro Mussolini guy. And it was interesting to listen to him, because it's something you just don't hear, especially, in right-wing circles in America, because they run from that idea of authoritarianism anyways. And so there's a certain perspective. Plus, I believe on the right in America, there's a heavy Zionist influence when it comes to politics anyways. The right wing has completely been co-opted. The left is absolute lunatic Marxist garbage over there, but the right has been co-opted by Zionists, I believe. That's my opinion. I won't get into that now. But Trad Patrick was an interesting guy, and he spent an entire podcast talking about, again, the Cruise of the Nona, this book that was written in the 30s by Hilaire Belloc, and the admiration Hilaire Belloc had for Mussolini. And so these are the two sources I'm going to draw from. And I think a lot of what I'll say here, I'll pull from Trad Patrick's podcast here, which I'm going to put this link up in the description box so you guys can listen to it. And Trad Patrick does a much better job of explaining this away. He's more proficient in sort of reading and research than I am. I'm a guy that kind of wings it. I read it, I formulate ideas, and I react off of it. But Trad Patrick had a pretty good talent for reading and understanding things much better than I do. And so he could go out and live much more than I could on a topic like this, and really speak more articulate than I can. But I find the Belloc-Mussolini sort of relationship fascinating, because as Catholics, we're kind of at a crossroads in these liberal societies. I've been having dialogues with classical liberal friends of mine of how we just need to accept abortion at this point in history, because we've lost the parliamentary game on abortion. And, Donald Trump is an example of how we need to continue to move on and evolve as American conservatives, so to speak. And it's amazing that we've reached this point, right? The great surrender of the right. And in many ways, this is what Belloc talks about in his time. The idea of parliamentary government and how corrupt parliamentary governments are, and how we'll rationalize the greatest evils in the world in order to fit within the framework of this left and right paradigm, this, again, parliamentary democratic paradigm that ultimately always gears us or at least herds us like a flock into, a certain stable, or whatever you want to call it, right? I'm not a farmer, so and this is what's all been designed to do. And the latest surrender on abortion is fascinating to me by the political right. Sad, the reality of abortion is evil. But Belloc is already talking about this in the problems of parliamentary government overseas, because he's seen the corruption of the English parliamentary system. And in Italy, they had the same problem before Mussolini, before his march on Rome in October of 1922, right? The Italian parliament was notoriously corrupt before Mussolini got in there. So Belloc sees it in England, Mussolini sees in Italy, and here we are in America today, and we're seeing the exact same thing. History just repeating itself. And so we just think we're a little bit smarter, and we could be more, what do you want to call it? More dignified, because we got better technology now, more information in our hands, and obviously we're living in the greatest society and culture in the history of the world, in sort of that classical liberal mindset. We're all the enlightened now at this point in history, right? Those generations of the past, going back 100 years, they were backward-ass authoritarian governments. We got freedom and liberty in America. Therefore, we got the freedom and liberty to think for ourselves and to have even greater ideas. In fact, it's been quite the opposite. That's the irony of it all. As I would argue that through our media, through our technology, through our means of rapid communication and rapid transit, we've actually become some of the most brainwashed people in the history of the world. And the greatest example of that is the absolute collapse in the moral breakdown of our society. And this is what Belloc is pointing out 100 years earlier here, right? Yep. So it's funny how things evolve. But let's go back here to the Tradition in Action article here by Patrick O'Doon, right? Like I said, he takes sort of the negative approach on this. He doesn't think Catholics should associate with not only Mussolini, but even Hilaire Belloc. Hilaire Belloc, he'll say this at the end of the article. It's problematic. Not only do he support Mussolini, which in itself is a problem, but also he was a supporter of the French Revolution, which this author here believes is a problem as well too for Catholics, and which makes Hilaire Belloc lose his credibility. Of course, the French Revolution was more complex for Hilaire Belloc, as historian Charles Colombes has said. He had family in the midst of the revolution over there. And I won't comment on it because I just don't know enough about Hilaire Belloc's view on the French Revolution. But generally, Hilaire Belloc is admired by a lot of people. Remember, him and Chesterton were kind of the co-thinkers or creators of the idea of distributism and the Catholic land movement and the importance of that, things that in many ways have all proven to be true as we've all been kicked off the land, and now we're all sort of cogs in a system of usury and banking and all this stuff that most people are suffering through now, as the West becomes more consolidated by the elite few. It's pretty fascinating. But let's go through this. It's fascinating, right? In 1925, the age of 55, Hilaire Belloc wrote The Cruise of the Nona. The book combines maritime adventure on his sailboat, the Nona, Italian nickname for grandmother, with his personal reflection and experiences. Some say that is the closest thing to an autobiography that Belloc ever wrote. Now, I find the name real quick here. Let me stop. The Cruise of the Nona, very interesting because Nona is an Italian word. Nona is how we call grandmother in Italian, at least in Sicilian it was, right? Right. My son calls my mother still today Nona, right? Cruise of the Nona, grandma, that's what it means. I don't know why that ship was named that, but that's what it was named. I continue on. In this book, he manifests his enthusiasm for Italian dictator Benito Mussolini and the movement that brought him to power, fascism. The introduction to the 1983 edition, written by Jonathan Rabin, explains well the mentality of the author one will encounter upon reading this book. Quote, the Belloc of the Cruise of the Nona is a very different figure, a genuinely dangerous character. The book begins softly enough in the language of romantic escapism, but by the time it has run its course, it has laid down a seductive program for regeneration of England. The program is explicitly fascist, and the real hero of the story is Mussolini, who had come to power in Italy in 1922, 3 years before Belloc's Cruise was first published. The politics and the romance of the book are intimately powerfully twined. It is the weirdest imaginable blend of Mein Kampf and Yachty Monthly. Mein Kampf. It's interesting considering Mussolini called Mein Kampf something like a brick or something like that, something that he thought was actually kind of crazy. So I think there's some truth to this. I think Belloc is clear by reading The Cruise of Nona was a real admirer of Benito Mussolini here. Obviously difficult for a lot of people to swallow because of negative connotations that fascism has been brought upon in the light of postmodern liberalism. And so let's continue on. The actual program for the regeneration of England is a topic for another article. The purpose of this article is to show my readers some of the enthusiasm Belloc professed for Mussolini and fascism. This is another concealed side of the author to which the common reader has no access. A pilgrimage to see Mussolini. Belloc is so enthused with Mussolini and fascism that he travels to Rome to interview him and feels the need to describe this trip in terms of a religious experience. Quote, I made a sort of a pilgrimage to see Mussolini, the head of the movement, and I wrote about him for the Americans. Had the honor of a long conversation with him, discovering and receiving his judgments. What a contrast with the sly and shifty talk of your parliamentarian, page 163. Well, This again refers to the nature of democracy in many ways, as he takes a shot at there. Because I think for Mussolini, and I think a lot of things I've read to you on the series that I've done here, and this is a constant theme by a lot of the authors, is that Mussolini was a straight talker. Mussolini said what he believed, which for many people is very refreshing. And what you come to find out about Mussolini, and this is one of the things that Belloc loves about him, is that he was not a historical figure looking to build upon his name. Rather, he was a guy that truly loved Italy. I've said this a number of times. And this is what Belloc is seen very early on from Mussolini. And so with a inherently anti-parliamentary bias, Mussolini comes off as very attractive. He comes into power. He settles the issues of communism that are infiltrating through Italy at the time, takes power and starts to get things done, which later on, Belloc will mention how in parliamentary governments, you have a bunch of figureheads in government that talk about fixing the problems, but never actually get it done. Lots of backdoor deals, lots of corruptions. At the end of the day, it's the people that get screwed. The nation itself loses its soul, and things will ultimately continue to unravel. And I think for the most part, since Belloc's time, we've seen that in all Western liberal republics, right? Let's continue on. He could not restrain his admiration for Mussolini and placed him above all the politicians he knew. Quote, what a sense of decision, of sincerity, of serving the nation, of serving it towards a known end. With a definite will, meeting this man after taking the parliamentarians in other countries was like meeting with some athletic friend of one's boyhood after an afternoon with racing touts. Or it was like coming upon a good wine in a Pyrenean village after compulsory draughts of marsh water in the Moses of the moors above during some long day's travel over the range. Page 164. And there you see it again, the admiration. Obviously, he's ecstatic. There's something about Mussolini that draws him near. I think the conversation with him, getting to know him, again, referring back to Trad Patrick, Belloc met with Mussolini, I think twice. And again, I'll put the link to Trad Patrick, and he explains this a lot better than I do. Met Mussolini twice, was really overwhelmed by his presence, his idea, straight shooter. I think a lot of it had to do because it conformed with his ideas of corporatism. And corporatism is interesting because it's a land movement idea, but it needs to be sort of, you need a political philosophy around it of how it's going to be properly kind of applied. And I think here, and again, I'm taking this from Trad Patrick, I think this is pretty right on, is that I think Belloc sees corporatism as a way to, again, get people back on the land. And in many respects, early on in the fascist regime, this is exactly what they did. And the irony of it all is that the fascists were big advocates of private property. And what they tried to do is work out a deal with the aristocratic class that controlled the majority of the property in Italy, because there was a lot of day workers in Italy, people that couldn't find jobs, day laborers, where employment was inconsistent. And so what the fascist regime wanted to do was give people a stake in the nation by getting them back on the land. So at the very least, they could work their land, do what they want to do, right? Farm, build a shop, whatever it is that you needed to do on your land. And land is a key resource needed by not only individuals, but by families in order to be able to sustain themselves, right? I mean, look at it today. I call it condo city, the condominium kind of culture we've built in America now, where homes are nothing but really for the utilitarian purpose of fulfilling the usury banking system that we now all live in. We have no land, and in that respect, we can't even fulfill the basic duties of life and of cultivating families, right? This is why, in many ways, the assault on the family has come from a lot of different directions, right? It's come morally through cultural Marxism, but it's also come from economics. And a lot of that from the right, to be honest with you, because listen, there's not a greater disincentive to have children than it is if you can't take care of them, if you don't have the means, the first of which living accommodations. You got to have the ability to take care of this family. First, to shelter them. Second, to be able to have some type of land to cultivate, whether it's to grow food or your stock or start a business, whatever it may be, just to have space. We don't do that. The fact that we build so many, what do you want to call it, ornamental homes now are purposely designed to keep our families small, to discourage the growth of family in our society. And this has always been a Marxist plot. And the irony of it all is it is the conservatives, the classical liberals that have all bought into this in the name of economic prudence, right? If you can't afford to have any children, you shouldn't have any children, right? That's the libertarian model. But of course, the entire society and culture has been geared to discourage the growth of family, to discourage the ability for everyday people to have children. And you wonder why population rates have absolutely collapsed in the West. And guess what? It's not just Italy and Japan not having kids anymore. It's the Americans not having kids at this point in history. That's the irony of it all. I mean, if you take away what? A few trad Catholics, there's not a whole lot of trad Catholics having kids, but there's some. You take away the Mormons and the Hispanics, who's having kids in America? Nobody. And as a guy that's out in the Midwest with the Mormons out here, okay, I can tell you one of the reasons why they can't have kids is because they did have space. They did run away from the mainline Protestant churches to the Midwest and had this area of the nation to themselves for about a century and a half, where there was plenty of space to cultivate families. But now with modern technology and modern transit, that's all been wiped out. With modern banking, usury banking systems now, that has put such a burden on the cost of land and homes, that's all been wiped out. And it's being wiped out even for the Mormons out in middle America. I'm just trying to give you examples how all this thing has come about us, right? And how our thinking has changed over time through sort of this, these historical movements that have slowly turned up the heat while we slowly get boiled in the pot. And this is what Belloc is referring to here, right? This is why distributism came about. And despite the claim that, oh, it's socialism. No, that is the liberal thing. When you hear Catholics say that distributism was socialism, because Benito Mussolini and in Italy, they proved that it wasn't socialism. You don't have to steal the land, because that's always the argument that these liberalized Catholics bring up. Well, you got to steal the land. If you steal the land, well, that violates private property rights. And well, wait a minute. You work it out is what you do. Don't have to steal the land. And in Italy, they prove that can work to a certain extent. You give people incentives. That's what you do in order to reform that economy, to give everybody a stake. You're not going to have children. You're not going to have a growing society without having the ability to cultivate families. That's just the bottom line. There's a reason why the worldwide population, or at least the population of the West, has collapsed, and nobody has any idea on how to fix this problem. So, but I digress. Let's move on. His praise is just as emphatic for fascism. According to Belloc, Italy was saved by fascism, a movement he sees as a fine reaction, full of virtues. Quote, Italy has done better than other nations after World War II, but only under the stress of a threatened dissolution. Society in Italy had to reach the point of acute peril before the reaction took place, which saved the country. What a fine reaction it was, not only in its virtues, but what is more important, in its spirit. What intelligence in its rejection of sophistry, and what virility in execution. May it last, but will it, even in Italy? Page 163. And so this goes back to what happened in Italy, particularly after World War I, after the Bolshevik revolutionaries started spreading all over the world, particularly targeting Western Europe. Of course, I understand it's going to be problematic for a lot of people who don't understand what fascism was. They see it as a tyrannical ideology that suppresses individual rights. But then again, in the land of individual rights, we've never had such suppression of the individual as it is anyways, right? There was a sense that you do this for your country, but there was a mutual respect back where it tried to balance the individual rights with the common good. And see, this is the interesting thing because you see it all over places like YouTube, right? Where socialism takes such an extreme interpretation that anything that involves the collective is automatically labeled as socialist. This is the von Mises school of thought. I mean, to such a degree now that apparently I'm hearing lately that if you buy stock in individual companies, say for example like Amazon, now you're part of a collective shareholders. The workers are now owning the means of production. Hence, to buy stocks in an individual company is now an act of socialism. You see how insane the logic eventually goes? As if the collective, as a society, you can't work together because we are communal creatures. We're born into social structures. We're not born as free individuals. We never were. That was the mantra given to us by a lot of conservatives like Rush Limbaugh, right? The whole pull yourself up by your bootstrap. But in fact, the first order, the first function of society is the family. You're born into a family. You're born dependent on your parents, the nurturing, the caring, the teaching, the apprenticeship, everything that comes with family. And the irony of it all is the mess that the West has become has come at the same time that the family has been trounced upon, right? Now, within that realm, we have some individual rights, and this is the point of the Catholic world, right? This is what fascism tried to balance out, that delicate balance between the collective and the individual. But because many conservatives don't know how to govern, they always have to go to one extreme or another. It's something I talked a lot about on this cast. It's either all individual rights or it's all collectivist, right? All individual rights will be the classical liberal Protestant West. All the collectivists will be the communists on the east side of the planet, right? But fascism, as Belloc notes, being the third way, tried to find an equilibrium between the two. Right now, of course, the immediate rebuttal by the classical liberals, yeah, but power lends to more power of government, right? Ultimate power corrupts, right? Lord Acton, right? Yeah, in Protestant nations where you don't have a more arbiter truth, Protestant nations that rebel against their ancestral roots, Protestant nations that inherently decided to rebel against the order of our ancestors. Let's be honest. Catholic nations, we have natural law. Catholic nations, we have the moral law of the church. Catholic nations can balance the two. Always have. It's Protestant nations that have these great insecurities because nobody knows who the moral arbiter of truth is. Because everybody is a god in their own right in the Protestant classical liberal nation. In the Catholic nations, we're all subservient to the church. We're all subservient to Christ through the church. And in many respects, the government has to respect the church. This is why the signing of the Lateran Accords, something Mussolini has never given enough credit for, was absolutely an unbelievable moment, right? It really changed fascism too, right? Because the early fascists, they weren't really on board, not only with religion in general, but even the Catholic Church. But the moment Mussolini brings in the church through the Lateran Accords in 1929, it shows you that fascism is willing to balance things out with proper morality and proper natural law in that respect. And that's why fascism can never become tyrannical like communism did or like the liberal West has become, right? That's the irony of it all. I mean, do you have a more tyrannical society than what we have in the West today? I mean, sure. If you get into the extreme elements of Soviet communism, Stalinism, that was pretty bad. I get that. But look at what we live under today. The dictatorship of democracy we live under today. Heavy taxation, heavy regulation, right? Did the fascists force you to get the jab in your arm? No, they never did anything like that. And I can just go down the list now. The acceptance of sodomy, the acceptance of abortion, the acceptance of all this moral depravity as a right guaranteed, enshrined by parliamentary government. That's what we do in America now. That is the greatest form of tyranny that there is. And we've done it by brainwashing, right? Through the ideals and principles of liberalism. We don't even second guess it. At least in the Soviet Union, while they were being persecuted, they still understood right from wrong. This is why the post-Soviet nations and even Russia itself came away with the faith still. They understand right from wrong. That's why they look at us today like we're a bunch of nut jobs hanging LGBT flags off embassies. They look at us like we've lost our minds over here. And they're right. See, this is why I say that the liberalism of the West, in many ways, is much more diabolical than really the Stalinist East was. Because we've all bought into it. We've all rationalized it away. Look at the political right today, rationalizing away abortion, saying we have to accept it now. We have to accept it. And the burden now is on those that oppose abortion because we're so mean-spirited to the women. To the women that have had abortion. How mean-spirited, how terrible is it for conservatives to tell a woman that killing her baby, reminding her that you just killed your baby. You understand how that woman feels? How can you tell a woman she killed her baby? And this is why we've lost the debate on abortion, is what conservatives will tell us. Of course, I would say we've lost the issue on abortion because we've accepted liberalism and its extreme form of individualistic rights, combined with religious indifferentism, all fallacies of the Enlightenment. But I digress. Let's see here. When he criticizes the modern English press, quote, no newspaper here, England, either foresaw or, when it arrived, made comprehensible the Italian movement, which led to the resurrection of the country by Mussolini, page 268. Now, of course, in England, they became very anti-fascist. And this is one of the reasons that separated Mussolini, the Italians, from the English in World War II. I've talked about this many times before. Mussolini desperately tried to keep Italy out of World War II. It wanted to be on the side of the Allies. But it was the English over and over and over again that broke treaties. Look at the Stresa Conference to begin with. The Easter Accords was another one, and a few other ones. Because one of the problems, again, because of parliamentary system, one of the problems that England had was you had this sort of negative connotation in the press, in the media at the time, where fascism goes against these Protestantized principles of liberalism. And for politicians to cut a deal with an authoritarian form of government in Italy would have been bad at the polls for the politicians. So this is why every time there was an agreement that Mussolini and the leaders of England came to, it was always the lower tier politicians, the parliamentarians, that came back to leadership and said, wait a minute, wait a minute. If you cut a deal with Mussolini, we're going to get wiped out at the polls here. We're going to get destroyed. So it became a situation where democracy could not do the right thing. It could not do the beneficial thing because it had to be beholden to a population that had its own ideas of what fascism was or how they have been indoctrinated through the media, through the press, right? And this is why it was several times that they actually had a deal with Mussolini, and that deal had to be broken off. It's why the British always stabbed the Italians in the back. Why it was so contemptible. The Italians were for the English. When it was the Italians warning the entire world long before Churchill comes into see that there's a problem here in Germany, and we have to deal with this now. Come with me. I'll join your side. We could take this on together. I can't stop him alone. But cutting deals with a fascist leader isn't good politics because, again, once you brainwash your population into liberalism, something that we do here in the States, by the way,
right? This is why we can't look at nuance very well. We're stuck in this left and right paradigm, and that's exactly where they want us, right? Right? This is why American politics makes no sense anymore. It's why we really don't even have a choice anymore at this point. It's why so many conservatives are rationalizing away evil in the name of winning the next election. What we get at the next election is what? A temporary reprieve, right? Maybe, possibly. But the nation is always going to the left. It has been since 1776. But again, I move on. Soon after his compliments, a continental newspaper that proposed a similar solution for England. He praises its good balance, judgment upon the situation, with a leaning towards the English interest regarded as nearly identical with the Italian. Belloc doesn't make a secret of support for dictatorship and the abolition of representative corps of states. Quote, the Italian parliament was contemptible and the Spanish was a joke. They have both been happily kicked in the street, and I trust we shall hear of them no more. The new dictatorship in Italy, for example, when it had cleared out the parliamentary nastiness, page 251. And of course, this refers to Mussolini abolishing the parliamentary system in Italy for the most part. Here, Belloc is obviously giving you a parallel at the time of the corruption of democracy, whether it was in Italy that it was a joke, whether it was in the Spanish parliamentary system was a joke. Remember, in Spain in 30, King Alfonso 13th abdicated the throne, I think 31, 32, right around there. And they voted in communism, straight communism. They voted it in through the parliamentary system. That's why he's saying it's a joke. It's a joke. And that's why Franco has to go in there eventually to clean out the nation. And yeah, it gets bloody and it's unfortunate. You know, and I think many people today, again, 100 years later, we look around the liberal West and all these republics are some kind of quasi-communist nation at this point in time. We're all seeing it everywhere. But again, our friends on the classical right have no answer other than double down. We got to vote harder. We got to vote harder. We got to vote harder. It's the sophistry. You know, it's amazing to me. It's just amazing to me how much we've deluded ourselves because we're out of ideas, right? Right. Plus, we've also defended these systems at the cost of great bloodshed. And to go back on that could be problematic. Could be a big guilt complex as well, too. Let's remember that. We continue on. His wishes for a continuation of this excellent experiment of fascism and hopes it will take root in Italy. But if it doesn't, at least he had the pleasure of visiting a country experiencing this impulse, which brought Mussolini to power. He finds consolation in the fact that in one section of Europe, at least things are going well, he states, quote, everything good in this world is doomed to perish. And I cannot tell you how long this excellent experiment will stand, or whether it would take firm root and make Italy all that it desires to be, and all that Italy should be, seeing the strength of the blood, the industry, the intelligence, and the warmth of all that people. But at any rate, it is good to visit a society still under such impulse and to feel that in one section of Europe, at least, things are going well, page 163. And there you go. Belloc goes to Italy. He likes what he sees over there. Italy's becoming an industrialized nation. Granted, it has its problems, right? Every nation does. Italy had some systematic problems because of its geographical location, lack of resources and industry as a result of that. But Benito's working with what he has, right? He's a Roman. He sees the greatness of Italy in its traditions, whether that be the old Roman Empire, which was a great empire one time, or whether that tradition was actually even Catholicism, which Mussolini really admired as well, too. And so for Belloc, you know, obviously getting to know Mussolini probably convinced him that, or at least Belloc convinced himself that Mussolini was a man of his word, and that his vision for Italy was one of love of Italy, and that you could get around and do things that need to be done. Not that Mussolini was perfect, I'm sure. And in fact, Trapp Patrick says this, not that Belloc agreed with everything Mussolini stood for or believed in, but it was going to be more than what you're going to get out of your parliamentary system, because he knew those systems were absolutely corrupt. So let me continue reading on. Belloc, in his admiration for Mussolini, going as far as to describe that ridiculous megalomaniac as a humble man who does not seek personal fame. Quote, yet there is one thing I've noted more than any other in the few men worthy of admiration in this our time, men worthy of admiration through their capacities as well as through their characters. It is the absence of ambition. There could be no better commentary upon the days in which we live. For it is reasonable and normal that men of great capacity should have ambition to exercise it in government, in the ordering of their fellow men. It was a chief quality always looked for by our fathers in those who rose high and who were worthy so to rise, nor were they disappointed. Ambition of old was a mark of greatness, but today is a mark of capable man that ambitions disgust him. The mark is most notable in Mussolini. It is not difficult to discover when you speak with Mussolini that his interest is in his job and not his name. And see, that is fascinating, because he also brings up the megalomaniac comment, which is what the left and the communists describe Mussolini as after the war, right? Right? You actually make a description of him, of what the opposite of his traits actually were. And yet again, you read a lot of the books that I've read on Mussolini, and it does describe a man that didn't care about his name. Remember, Mussolini was considered the poor dictator. He didn't take a salary from his government. He had a very meager leaving materially. He hated money. His wife, in the autobiography she wrote about Mussolini, said, listen, when he dies, all they're going to find is a handkerchief in his pocket. He never even carried money around. He had a modest little home that they bought off his what is it, his salary off his newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia. She bitterly complained to Mussolini, saying, listen, I need money to run the household. See, because he didn't touch the money. He hated the money. He brought it home to his wife. And a lot of Italian men did this in those days. You brought your money home to your wife, and she handled the household. And they had a very modest home, to such a degree that when he rose to power in Italy as the prime minister in 1922, people were like, well, wait a minute, you're the prime minister. You're going to have a bunch of dignitaries and foreign events and visitors. You need a better home here. That one of the local princes, I think it was the Via Torlonia, actually rented Mussolini the house out, the palace out, for like €1 a year, as a way to, okay, you're the prime minister, there's a certain procedure that comes with this. And Mussolini was hesitant to take it. He didn't want to take it. It wasn't about material wealth for Mussolini. It was about honor. It was about duty. It was about faith. It was about culture. It was about the nation. It was about, everything that makes us in this life. And after a century and a half of this sort of capitalist, communist kind of war about the material dialectic, about how we're going to make the money and who's going to make the money and who's going to control the means of production, where's it going to go? Fascism rises as the third way to counter that. Because they saw capitalism and communism as two sides of the same coin, arguing over money and resources when there was greater things in the world. And for Mussolini, it's something that he didn't seek. It wasn't part of his personality. You read it in all the documents, you read it in all the books. Yeah, he had vices, don't get me wrong. He loved the ladies. And he had his share of affairs, without a doubt. Without a doubt. But then again, what leaders really haven't had that problem? Yeah, sure, you've had some Catholic kings that have restrained themselves. But let's not get started with politicians and parliamentary government when it comes to their affairs, right? especially in America, of all places. Oh, the irony of it all, you know. But this is what you get from Mussolini. Yeah, look at this quote here: "The humble Mussolini in a blatant manifestation of megalomania." Right? It's funny, because for this author, the megalomania, of course, is, like I said, a standard liberal trope. And of course, because when you see Mussolini on video footage, or you hear him on video footage, he kind of has a strong stance and pose. He speaks with a lot of passion, right? And a lot of people like Trad Patrick will tell you, listen, that's what leaders do. That's what leaders do. I say he was Italian. He was very expressive. And when you unite the nation behind a leader, yeah, to a certain degree, the leader has to be expressive, has to be bold. That's who you're following. Whether it's a king, whether it's an authoritarian leader, whether it's a fascist leader, it is what it is. But it's not the public appearance as a leader of the nation that you need to look at. It's who he was in his home life. He was a humble man, hated money. He didn't seek personal wealth. He didn't seek fame and ambition. They say that he was home every night with his family. That's what he cared about the most. He got up every morning, went to work, did the affairs of state, came home, and never spent the night away from his family. I know. And let's wrap this up here, okay? Who is behind Belloc's unwarranted prestige? It is common in the traditions and conservative milieu of the United States to see Belloc presented as an indisputable Catholic leader of the best possible orientation, almost as if he were a doctor of the church, particularly in the field of Catholic social doctrine. Also, the epithet, the Catholic historian, is often applied to him. Opposing this general orientation, I have already written various articles showing that this man was but a liberal in its worst meaning. That is, an admirer of Rousseau, an opponent of the popes, a partisan of the French Revolution and the Terror, and an advocate of the murderers of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, and an enemy of the Catholic Vendée. In this article, I demonstrated Belloc adds to this list of anti-Catholic positions that of being an unconditional admirer of fascism. I asked my readers, are these authentic traditionalists and conservatives? I think not. Any man can be defined by the thinker he presents as an ideal. Now then, if you apply the characteristics of Belloc that I just mentioned to those who are promoting him, disseminating his books, and making him a central hero for traditionalism and conservatism in the US, you will see that they share many or all of the same traits. Thus, what you really have are pseudo-traditionalists, de facto liberals, revolutionaries, adherents of egalitarianism, partisans of dictatorship, and admirers of fascism. I believe that when you look around, these false traditionalists are quite easy to find. When you find them, you will have at hand the present-day representatives of the American false right. Booyah! That is such an absurd ending to that article by Mr. What's his name here? Odu, right? Let me ask you a question, Mr. Odu. Was Pope Pius XI a false traditionalist? Was he? You know, Pope Pius XI and Mussolini formed a very strong friendship, right? You know, Pope Pius XI awarded Mussolini the highest award a layperson could ever receive in the church. You know that Pope Pius XI basically said of Mussolini he was a man sent by divine providence. You know, many of the blesseds have said that Mussolini was brought to Italy by Christ to save Italy from a Bolshevik-style revolution. Do you know that Mussolini was good friends with Padre Pio, him and his wife? You know that? You know that Mussolini's soul was attributed to by many mystics as, at the very least, getting to purgatory. Do you know that Mussolini saved the church? Do you know that Mussolini in the Lateran Accords gave the church her honor and her glory back after it was stomped down by a bunch of Freemasons? Do you know that Mussolini actually stomped out Freemasonry? Do you know that Mussolini was actually the last temporal defender of the church? You know, and Mussolini had a conversion back to his Catholic faith. You know, Mussolini went to confession. And Mussolini went to mass at the end of his life. Mussolini asked a priest at the island of Ponzo that if he would say a mass for his son Bruno, who was deceased. You know, when one of Mussolini's daughters was very ill and he thought she was dying, he held up the rosary of his mother, looked up in the sky, and begged God and the Holy Mother to save and spare the life of his child. Do you know that Mussolini had a strong relationship with Cardinal Schuster? Cardinal Schuster became his spiritual advisor. You know that Mussolini went into the convents that were all breaking down, deteriorating because of lack of money and resources, and he funded the nuns and the priests that needed these resources to help them stay vibrant. You know what Mussolini did for the church in Italy? Sure, you say, well, God takes care of the church. Yeah, fine, I get it. I get it. God takes care of the church. But that doesn't mean God doesn't use people, tools. And I'm sorry, this whole thing of, see, the whole trad thing bothers me. And this is where I'm odd, because I don't consider myself a trad. I don't consider myself Novus Ordo. I'm Sicilian. I'm a Sicilian Catholic. I don't even know what traditionalist means, because I feel like it's a term that's been concocted by Catholics in America that are trying to distinguish themselves from the modern problems of the church. I get that. But I always hear fake trads, fake trads, fake trads every 5 minutes. If you don't agree with my gospel, you're a fake trad. If you don't agree with his gospel, you're a fake trad. Everybody's a fake trad in this trad world online. Just amazing to me. And it's just a world that I don't recognize. Sorry. I only ran into this traditional stuff online about a decade ago. And I get it. We got problems in the church. I understand it. I think the problem with trads is they've been Americanized. And they've bought into the liberal propaganda. Anyways, Hilaire Belloc was a great admirer of Mussolini. I suggest, now, wait a minute, let me stop there. Because see, I'm more of a fair and balanced guy. I'm going to give you the good with the bad with Mussolini. I think Mussolini tried to do some really good things. I think he accomplished a lot of good things, but made lots of mistakes. And I'm going to tell you what those mistakes are. Me, I just get through the sophistry and the BS that I continue to see from everybody. And I just see here when Mr. Udo an agenda. And what I see is a fear of history, because we've been so brainwashed by sort of this classical American liberalism thing. He accuses, in this article, he accuses the trads or Belloc of being what I see in himself, and that is a fear to look at Italian fascism, a Catholic nation that was dealing with the infiltration of classical liberalism from the West and Bolshevism from the East. They were trying to figure out how to survive. This is what all these fascist nations were doing, whether it was Franco in Spain, whether it was Salazar in Portugal, whether it was Dolphus in Austria, whether it was Mussolini, and to a certain extent, even in Germany. I get it. Germany is more complex with the failed Austrian painter. but it's complex because it's a nation that was divided at the Reformation. It's half Protestant, and Protestantism destroys everything. It destroys every society there is. But those Catholic nations that kept their hegemony, Portugal, Italy, Austria, Spain, they were dealing with these problems. And you weren't going to deal with them with freedom and liberty and democracy, because we've seen what democracy has done. Are we still blind to this? You're not going to have Enlightenment ideas taking a hold in Catholic nations. The church wouldn't even go with that. Are you kidding me right now? I get it. Fascism has got a bad omen because they were the losers and the communists and the classical liberals got to rewrite history. I get it. It's a horrible name. I get it. Nobody will give time of day. We hear it every 5 minutes. Nobody knows what the definition actually is, but we hear the word every 5 minutes as a negative connotation to destroy your political enemies in modern political times. I get it. I get it. And nobody wants to deal with it. It's too big of a uphill battle to deal with. I get it. But really, Mr. Odu? Really? It's not how the church in Rome felt. It's not how Pope Pius XI felt. You know what's interesting too? Even after the death of Mussolini, at the hands of communist partisans, the body strung up in Milan, in the piazza, it was desecrated. Only communists do such revolting things. But even afterwards, right? Even afterwards, the body was taken away by the American government. A piece of Benito's brain was taken out so they could do research on what it's like to be this megalomaniac that the Western republics and the communists told. See, that's the thing about it, right? When you use the term megalomaniacs, you're using the language of Marxists and leftists. But they had to study a part of his brain to see what makes, dictators or fascists or authoritarian leaders so evil. Would we ever conceive the same ideas from an American president? Would we? And we've had some evil American presidents. No, we would never do that. That's all part of the propaganda. Mr. Adu, you've fallen for it. You've fallen for it. You've let the winners of history decide in your mind what right and wrong is and what good and evil is. And I'm not sure the good guys won after World War II. You've been fooled, Mr. Adu. But one last point, and I'll let you go with this. The body was returned to his wife, Raquel, about a decade after. Remember, she barely complained. My husband never got a Christian burial. She wanted a Christian burial for Mussolini. But the body was kept by the American government. And finally, when they did bring it back, they put it in an unmarked grave because they didn't want anybody desecrating it for many years. And then finally, they had to move it. And actually, the body of Mussolini wound up in the hands of Catholic monks. And the Catholic monks protected the body of Mussolini. They hid it in monasteries throughout Italy. They moved it around so it wouldn't be found. But it was the church. It was the Catholic Church. Priests, monks, brothers, who had great veneration, great respect for El Duce. And they protected his body until finally Benito got his Christian burial. I believe his body now is, where is it? It's in Prepadapio, I believe it's pronounced, his hometown. So you can't disassociate fascism with Catholicism, as much as we don't want to take on that argument. You can't. You can't disassociate fascism with Italy. And you can't dissociate Italy with fascism. They're all intertwined. If you want to buy a bunch of liberal propaganda on how you want to view that time in history as something of great disgust, it's up to you. But I would suggest you haven't given history a fair chance. You haven't. Mussolini was far from perfect. Belloc was far from perfect. But an article like this is disgusting. I probably wouldn't paint it as rosy as Trad Patrick, but I put the link in the description. I think Trad Patrick, for the most part, does a great job explaining this relation between Mussolini and Hilaire Belloc. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you for joining me. Part 26, Mussolini, an Italian-American experience. Signing off. This is Frank. Good night, everybody.